"I'm pregnant with your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered to me at the family dinner table, and for a moment I honestly thought I had misheard her. The words were so calm, so matter-of-fact, that they didn't even sound cruel at first. They sounded like the kind of sentence your brain refuses to understand until it's already too late. I was standing beside the dining table in my son's house in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes I had just brought from the kitchen. The room smelled like roasted chicken, rosemary, and fresh bread, the kind of comforting Sunday dinner scent that had filled our family gatherings for more than 30 years. My son Daniel was at the head of the table, laughing about something his coworker had done earlier that week. My husband Richard sat beside him, quietly cutting his chicken into neat little pieces the way he always did. My granddaughter Emma was trying to convince her younger brother that peas were not tiny green monsters. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. Then Olivia walked up beside me, leaned slightly closer as if she were simply asking me to pass the gravy, and said those words in a voice so soft no one else could hear. I froze with the serving spoon still in my hand. I remember staring at the white ceramic bowl like it had suddenly become the most fascinating object in the world, because looking at her face felt impossible. For a second I wondered if this was some strange joke, some twisted attempt at humor that I simply didn't understand. Olivia had always been polite with me, almost overly polite, the kind of careful politeness that made you feel like you were talking to someone wearing a perfectly practiced smile. I slowly set the bowl on the table in front of Daniel. He thanked me without even looking up from his conversation. No one noticed anything unusual. No one noticed that my hands had begun to tremble slightly. Olivia stepped back and returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. She picked up her fork, took a small bite of chicken, and began chatting with Emma about a school project. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have seen a perfectly ordinary American family enjoying a Sunday dinner. I remained standing there for a moment longer than necessary, trying to decide whether I had imagined it. At 67 years old, you start to question your hearing sometimes. Maybe she said something else. Maybe I misunderstood. But then Olivia looked up at me across the table. She didn't smile. She didn't look embarrassed. She simply held my gaze for a brief second, calm and steady, and I realized something that made my chest feel strangely hollow. She had meant every word. I sat down slowly beside my husband. Richard glanced at me briefly, the same casual glance he'd given me thousands of times over our 42 years of marriage, and asked if I wanted him to pass the salt. I nodded automatically, even though I had no idea whether my food needed salt. Around me, the dinner conversation continued. Daniel was talking about a new client. The kids were arguing about dessert. The soft clinking of forks and knives filled the room. But inside my mind, something had shifted in a quiet, irreversible way. Because the more I replayed Olivia's whisper in my head, the more certain I became that this dinner, this ordinary evening that looked so peaceful on the surface, had just become the moment when my entire understanding of my own family began to unravel. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange blur, like watching a familiar movie where someone had quietly changed the ending without telling you. I picked up my fork and moved food around my plate, making sure to take small bites every few minutes so no one would notice that I had completely lost my appetite. Daniel kept talking about a project at his consulting firm, explaining something about deadlines and travel schedules, and Richard nodded along as if he understood every detail. The children finished their vegetables and immediately began negotiating for dessert. The soft yellow light above the dining table made the entire room feel warm and comfortable, the kind of place where nothing bad should ever happen. But every few seconds my mind replayed Olivia's whisper. Each time I heard it again in my memory, it sounded clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. I looked across the table at her without letting my eyes linger too long. She was helping Emma cut a piece of apple pie into smaller bites, smiling gently, speaking in that calm voice everyone always described as thoughtful and kind. If someone had asked me a year earlier to describe my daughter-in-law, I probably would have used words like organized, responsible, and polite. She had been part of our family for 8 years. She and Daniel had met during their final year of college in Boston, and from the very beginning she seemed determined to be the perfect addition to our family. She remembered birthdays. She brought thoughtful gifts during holidays. She offered to help clean up after dinners even when I insisted she did not need to. And yet, sitting there that evening, I realized something uncomfortable. Olivia was not looking at me the way people normally look at someone they respect, or even someone they simply like. Every time our eyes met, there was a strange calmness in her expression, almost like she was waiting for something to happen. It was not fear. It was not guilt. It was patience. I turned my attention toward Richard. My husband had always been a quiet man. After 42 years of marriage, you learn the small habits of another person so well that they become almost invisible. The way he held his fork. The way he folded his napkin before placing it beside his plate. The way he cleared his throat softly before speaking. Those small details had once been comforting because they represented stability. But now I found myself watching him with a different kind of attention, the kind people use when they are searching for clues. Richard finished his meal and asked Emma about her soccer game scheduled for Saturday morning. His tone was warm and patient, exactly the way a grandfather should sound. Nothing about his behavior suggested that anything unusual had happened. That might have been the most unsettling part of the entire evening. Olivia had said something that should have shattered the room like broken glass. Yet the conversation continued as if nothing had changed. Daniel poured himself another glass of iced tea and asked if anyone wanted coffee with dessert. The children began clearing their plates. Olivia stood up and started gathering dishes, moving around the kitchen with smooth efficiency. She passed directly behind my chair at one point, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of vanilla from her perfume. She did not stop walking. She did not say another word to me, but for a brief second, she rested her hand lightly on the back of my chair, almost like a casual gesture of balance. That tiny movement sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Because in that moment I understood something important. Olivia had not whispered those words because she wanted to confess anything. She had whispered them because she wanted me to know. And the calm look on her face told me that whatever truth she had just placed in my hands was only the beginning of something much larger. I stayed at the table longer than I normally would have, long after the children had finished dessert and Daniel began loading the dishwasher. Normally I would have insisted on helping, but that night I felt strangely rooted to my chair, as if standing up too quickly might cause something fragile inside me to shatter. Richard eventually pushed his chair back and stretched his arms the way he often did after a big meal. He thanked Daniel for dinner and walked into the living room where the evening news was beginning. His voice sounded relaxed, perfectly ordinary, and that ordinary tone made the situation feel even more unreal. I watched him disappear around the corner and wondered how a person could move through a room so calmly while carrying something so heavy behind his back. Olivia continued rinsing dishes at the sink beside Daniel, speaking to him about Emma's upcoming school recital and the permission slip that needed to be signed before Friday. Their conversation sounded like the dozens of small domestic conversations I had heard between them over the years. The kind of conversation that belongs to people who share a comfortable life together. Yet every word Olivia spoke now seemed to carry a second meaning I could not quite reach. After a few minutes, Daniel finished stacking the plates and turned to me with an easy smile. He asked if I wanted him to pack some leftovers for me to take home. I nodded and thanked him, forcing my voice to sound steady. He wrapped a small container of roasted chicken and vegetables and placed it in a paper bag. When he handed it to me, he looked exactly the same as he had when he was 10 years old, bringing home a school drawing he was proud of. The same gentle eyes. The same quiet kindness. Watching him stand there filled me with a deep and painful awareness that whatever truth Olivia had whispered earlier would eventually reach him too. And when it did, his life would not look the same again. I stood up slowly and gathered my purse from the chair beside me. Olivia dried her hands with a kitchen towel and walked me to the front door. Daniel was still inside talking to the children about brushing their teeth before bedtime. For a moment the hallway was quiet except for the faint sound of the television from the living room. Olivia opened the door and the cool night air drifted inside. The street outside was peaceful, the kind of quiet suburban street where porch lights glow softly and neighbors wave to one another on morning walks. I stepped onto the front porch and turned slightly toward her. She leaned against the doorframe with that same calm expression she had worn all evening. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been pressing against my chest since the moment she whispered to me at the dinner table. I asked her why she had told me something like that in the middle of a family dinner. Olivia did not look surprised by the question. In fact, she looked almost relieved that I had finally asked it. She folded her arms loosely and studied my face in the quiet porch light. When she answered, her voice was steady and clear, as if she had already rehearsed the words many times in her mind. She said that some secrets eventually become too heavy to carry alone, and that sometimes the truth finds its way out whether people are ready for it or not. Then she added something that made the night air suddenly feel colder. She said that sooner or later everyone in this family was going to learn the truth anyway, and she believed it was only fair that I heard it first. I stood there holding the paper bag of leftovers while those words settled slowly into my thoughts. In that moment, I realized that whatever story I thought I understood about my own family was beginning to change, and I had the uneasy feeling that Olivia had just opened a door that none of us would be able to close again. I drove home that night with the paper bag of leftovers resting on the passenger seat beside me, but I could not remember a single detail of the drive itself. The familiar streets of Cedar Grove passed by in quiet darkness, the same houses, the same streetlights, the same peaceful neighborhood where my family had lived for decades. Normally I enjoyed those short evening drives because they gave me time to think, but that night my mind felt strangely crowded and empty at the same time. Olivia's words repeated themselves again and again, each repetition making them sound less like a misunderstanding and more like a carefully placed truth. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was already on, casting a soft circle of yellow across the front steps. Richard's car was not there yet. That alone should not have meant anything unusual. He sometimes stayed behind to finish a conversation with Daniel or to help the children with homework. But as I sat there in the quiet car, hands resting on the steering wheel, I realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in more than 40 years of marriage, I did not know what my husband was doing or where his thoughts truly were. I eventually stepped out of the car and walked into the house. The living room looked exactly the way it always did in the evening. A lamp glowed beside the sofa. A folded newspaper sat on the coffee table. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. I placed the bag of leftovers in the refrigerator and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the neat rows of containers and shelves as if the answer to everything might be hiding between them. Then something strange began happening inside my mind. Memories started rising to the surface one by one, small moments from the past year that I had never questioned before. At the time they seemed harmless, almost invisible, but now they appeared different, like puzzle pieces that suddenly belonged to the same picture. I remembered the afternoon Olivia had stopped by our house last spring while Daniel was traveling for work in Chicago. She had said she needed help with a recipe and wanted to borrow one of my cookbooks. Richard had been home that day because he was working remotely from his study. I had thought nothing of it. Olivia stayed for nearly an hour, chatting comfortably in the kitchen while Richard occasionally stepped out to refill his coffee. At the time it had looked like a perfectly normal visit between family members. But now, replaying that afternoon in my mind, I could see something I had not noticed before. The way they had both fallen silent when I walked back into the room after answering a phone call. The quick glance they exchanged, brief but unmistakable. I remembered another moment during Thanksgiving dinner the previous year. Richard had offered to drive Olivia home because Daniel needed to leave early for an evening conference call. The drive to their house was only 15 minutes away, and Richard returned about 40 minutes later saying there had been traffic near the highway exit. I had believed him without question. After all, trust is something that grows quietly over decades. You stop measuring time so carefully because you believe the person beside you would never give you a reason to doubt it. Standing alone in the kitchen that night, I slowly closed the refrigerator door and leaned against the counter. The house felt unusually quiet without Richard's presence. Outside, a car passed along the street, and its headlights briefly flashed across the living room wall before disappearing again. I realized then that Olivia had not only placed a terrible possibility into my mind. She had opened a door to every small memory I had once dismissed without thought. And now those memories were beginning to rearrange themselves into a pattern I was not ready to face. Richard came home about 40 minutes later. I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway and the quiet hum of the garage door opening beneath the house. For a moment, I remained exactly where I was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching the reflection of the hallway light on the polished surface of the refrigerator. The front door opened and closed with its usual soft click. Richard walked inside and set his keys down in the small ceramic bowl we had kept by the door for nearly 20 years. That small sound, the light clink of metal against ceramic, had always meant something simple and comforting to me. It meant my husband was home. But that night the sound felt different, almost like the first note of a conversation I was not ready to have. He stepped into the kitchen a moment later and smiled the same easy smile he always gave me at the end of a long evening. He asked if the drive home had been quiet and whether Daniel had packed leftovers for me the way he usually did. His voice sounded relaxed, steady, completely ordinary. I nodded and told him yes. Daniel had sent some roasted chicken and vegetables. Richard walked to the refrigerator and opened the door, glancing at the container I had placed on the middle shelf. Then he poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter across from me. For several seconds neither of us spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of everyday quiet that exists naturally between people who have shared most of their lives together. And yet, as I watched him standing there, I noticed small details I had never paid attention to before. The way he avoided looking directly into my eyes. The way his fingers tapped lightly against the side of the glass before he took a sip. Those details might have meant nothing on any other night. But now my mind was examining everything with a careful, almost unfamiliar attention. Richard eventually asked if something was wrong, because I seemed unusually quiet. I told him I was simply tired, and that the evening had been longer than I expected. That was not entirely untrue. In a way, the evening had felt longer than any ordinary Sunday dinner. He accepted my answer without question and began telling me about a conversation he had with Daniel regarding a possible family trip next summer. He spoke about renting a small lake house in Maine, somewhere peaceful where the children could swim and run around outside. As he described the idea, I watched his face carefully. There was warmth in his voice when he spoke about the grandchildren. There was pride when he mentioned Daniel's work. Everything about his tone sounded sincere. But beneath that sincerity, I could not stop hearing Olivia's whisper echoing quietly inside my thoughts. Eventually, Richard finished his water and carried the empty glass to the sink. He rinsed it under the faucet and placed it carefully in the drying rack the same way he had done thousands of times before. When he turned back toward me, he asked if I was ready to go upstairs because it was already close to 10 o'clock. I nodded again and followed him toward the staircase. As we climbed the steps together, I realized something that made the quiet house feel even heavier around me. For more than 4 decades, Richard had been the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. I knew the rhythm of his breathing when he slept. I knew the sound of his footsteps in every room of the house. And yet that night, walking up those familiar stairs beside him, I suddenly understood that there might be entire parts of his life I had never truly seen at all. I did not sleep much that night. Richard fell asleep within minutes the way he always did, turning slightly onto his side and letting out a quiet breath as the house settled into silence. I lay beside him staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing and the distant ticking of the hallway clock. Those sounds had always been comforting to me. They were the quiet signals of a long and stable life, the kind of peaceful routine people build over decades without even realizing it. But that night the same sounds felt different, almost like reminders of something fragile that might already be breaking apart. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, from the moment we arrived at Daniel's house to the moment Olivia whispered those words beside the dinner table. The strange calm in her voice. The steady look in her eyes. The way she walked back to her chair afterward, as if she had simply mentioned the weather. None of it felt like the behavior of someone confessing a mistake. It felt more like someone revealing a fact that had already existed for a long time. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I quietly slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The living room was dark except for a thin strip of light coming from the street outside. I sat on the sofa and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, trying to slow the steady movement of thoughts in my mind. At some point I realized that the most frightening part of the situation was not the possibility that Olivia had told the truth. The frightening part was that I no longer trusted my own ability to recognize it. For 42 years I believed I understood my husband completely. I knew his routines, his habits, the stories he liked to tell at family gatherings. I believed those small details added up to a full picture of who he was. But now that picture felt incomplete, like a photograph where an important part had been quietly erased. Eventually, the first light of morning began to appear through the living room window. The sky turned pale gray, and the quiet neighborhood slowly came to life. A delivery truck passed down the street. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once and then went silent again. I stood up and walked into the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. The simple routine of measuring the grounds and pouring the water felt strangely grounding. It reminded me that ordinary life was still continuing even if my understanding of it had changed. When Richard came downstairs about 30 minutes later, he greeted me with the same warm voice he always used in the morning. He asked if I had slept well and kissed my cheek before reaching for a coffee mug. I told him I had woken up early and could not fall back asleep. He nodded sympathetically and began reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Watching him sit there in the soft morning light felt surreal. He looked exactly the same as he had the day before, the same thoughtful expression as he read the headlines, the same quiet presence that had always filled the room with calm. And yet something inside me had shifted permanently. I realized that from this moment forward, I could not simply accept the surface of things the way I once had. Olivia had planted a question in my mind, and questions have a way of growing when they are left unanswered. So that morning, while Richard calmly turned the pages of the newspaper and the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, I made a quiet decision that would change everything. I was not going to confront anyone. Not yet. Instead, I was going to watch. I was going to listen. And I was going to begin paying attention to every small detail I had once ignored, because somewhere inside those details the truth was waiting. Over the next few days I kept my promise to myself and said nothing to anyone about what Olivia had whispered. Outwardly my life continued exactly the same as it always had. I watered the plants on the back patio. I went to the grocery store on Tuesday morning the way I had done for years. I called my sister in Ohio and talked with her about the weather and her new garden. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen an ordinary week in the life of a 67-year-old woman enjoying the quiet rhythm of retirement. But inside my mind something had changed. Every small detail now felt important. Every glance and every conversation carried a weight it never had before. Richard continued his routines without any visible difference. He left the house each morning around 8:30 for his office downtown and returned around 5:30 in the evening. Sometimes he stopped by the hardware store or the pharmacy on his way home. Those errands had always seemed harmless, part of the quiet routine of a man who liked to keep busy. But now I noticed the exact times he left and the exact times he returned. I noticed how often he checked his phone during dinner. I noticed the way he occasionally stepped outside to take a call even though the reception inside the house was perfectly fine. None of those details alone meant anything certain. Yet together they formed a quiet pattern that my mind could not ignore. On Wednesday afternoon something happened that made that pattern feel even clearer. I was in the living room folding laundry when Richard's phone buzzed on the coffee table beside me. Normally I would not pay attention to something so private. For 42 years we had respected each other's space, without question. But that afternoon the sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. The screen lit up briefly before going dark again. I was not trying to invade his privacy, but my eyes moved toward the screen before I could stop myself. For just a second I saw the name that appeared there. Olivia. My hand stopped moving in the middle of folding a towel. The phone buzzed again a moment later, as if whoever was calling wanted to make sure the message had been noticed. I stood there staring at the device, feeling the strange mixture of disbelief and recognition that sometimes comes when a suspicion begins to take shape. Richard was upstairs in his study finishing a work call. The house was otherwise completely silent. I could have simply walked away. I could have ignored the message and pretended I had never seen the name on the screen. That would have been the easier choice. Instead, I placed the folded laundry neatly on the chair beside me and sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa. For the first time since Olivia spoke to me at the dinner table, I felt the quiet weight of reality settling into place. Because the message on that phone did not look like a coincidence. It looked like the first visible thread of a truth that had been hidden for a long time. And in that moment I realized something important. Watching from a distance was no longer enough. If I wanted to understand what was really happening inside my own family, I was going to have to follow that thread wherever it led. I did not touch Richard's phone that afternoon. Instead, I sat there for several seconds letting the quiet of the room settle around me again. The screen had already gone dark, leaving the device looking completely ordinary on the coffee table. For years that phone had simply been another object in our house, something I barely noticed. Now it felt different, almost like a locked door sitting in the middle of the room. I finished folding the rest of the laundry slowly, and carried the stack upstairs as if nothing unusual had happened. When I passed Richard's study, I could hear his voice through the half-closed door, speaking calmly about a project deadline and a meeting scheduled for Friday morning. His tone sounded focused and professional, exactly the way he always spoke during work calls. Listening to him, I realized something strange. If Olivia had never whispered to me at the dinner table, I probably would have forgotten that brief message on his phone within minutes. But now every small moment seemed connected to something larger I could not yet see clearly. Later that evening, Richard and I sat down for dinner together in the kitchen. I made a simple meal of grilled chicken and green beans, the kind of quiet weeknight dinner we had shared hundreds of times before. Richard talked about a new client his office had taken on and mentioned that he might need to travel to Hartford the following week. I listened carefully to every word while pretending to focus on my plate. When he finished speaking, I asked him an ordinary question about how long the trip might last. He said it would probably only be one night, maybe two at the most. His answer sounded natural, but my mind quietly noted the detail anyway. The next morning, something else happened that made the pattern feel even stronger. Richard left the house a little earlier than usual, saying he needed to stop by the office supply store before work. About 30 minutes later, I decided to run a few errands of my own. I drove toward the grocery store on Main Street, taking the same route I had used for years. As I approached the intersection near the small coffee shop on Maple Avenue, I slowed at the traffic light and glanced toward the parking lot. That was when I saw a car that looked very familiar. It was Richard's car, parked near the far end of the lot beside the outdoor seating area. At first I assumed he had simply stopped for coffee before work, which would not have been unusual. But as I waited for the light to change, my eyes moved toward the tables outside the cafe. Two people were sitting together beneath a large green umbrella. One of them was Richard. The other was Olivia. They were leaning slightly toward each other across the small round table, speaking quietly in the calm morning sunlight, while people walked past them on their way to work. From my position at the intersection, I could not hear what they were saying. I could only see the relaxed way they sat there, the easy familiarity between them that looked nothing like a casual meeting between relatives. The traffic light turned green, and the cars behind me began moving forward. I drove through the intersection slowly, keeping my eyes on the road ahead, even though my mind was still fixed on the image I had just seen. For a long time after that moment, I said nothing to anyone. But as I continued driving toward the grocery store, one thought became clearer than all the others. Olivia had not whispered those words to me as a warning. She had whispered them because she knew that sooner or later I would begin to see the truth with my own eyes. For the rest of that day, I moved through my errands as if everything around me were slightly quieter than usual. The grocery store looked the same as it always did, with rows of fresh produce and the low hum of carts rolling across the polished floor, but my thoughts kept returning to the image of Richard and Olivia sitting together at that small cafe table. They had looked comfortable, almost relaxed, as if the meeting were something completely ordinary. That detail stayed with me the entire drive home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I understood that the uncertainty I had been carrying since the family dinner was beginning to fade. In its place was something steadier, something calmer. Not anger, not panic, just clarity. I walked into the house and set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. The house was silent again. The same quiet space that had once felt peaceful, but now seemed to echo with questions. I unpacked the groceries slowly, placing each item in its place as if completing a familiar ritual. When I finished, I stood for a moment at the kitchen window looking out toward the backyard. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the grass, and the small maple tree Daniel planted years ago when the children were still toddlers. Watching that quiet scene reminded me how many years of my life had been built around the idea of family. Every holiday meal, every birthday celebration, every ordinary Sunday afternoon had been part of that structure. And yet now I could see that the structure itself had begun to shift long before I realized it. Later that evening, Richard came home at his usual time. He greeted me the same way he always did, placing his briefcase by the door and asking how my day had gone. His voice carried the same familiar warmth. If I had not seen what I saw earlier that morning, I might have believed everything was exactly as it appeared. We sat down for dinner together, a quiet meal of soup and toasted bread. Richard spoke about work and mentioned that he might stop by the coffee shop again later in the week because they served a new blend he liked. I listened carefully without interrupting. He did not realize that I already knew exactly which coffee shop he meant. When the meal was finished, I cleared the table and washed the dishes while Richard watched the evening news in the living room. The soft sound of the television drifted into the kitchen as I dried the last plate and placed it in the cabinet. For a moment, I rested my hands on the edge of the counter and took a slow breath. The situation no longer felt confusing the way it had a few days earlier. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Olivia's whisper, the message on Richard's phone, the quiet meeting at the cafe. Each detail connected to the next like steps along a path I had never intended to follow. I walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair across from Richard. He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the television screen. That small moment told me something important. He was still completely unaware that the truth had already begun to reveal itself. And in that quiet realization, I felt a calm I had not expected. Because I finally understood what Olivia had meant when she said the truth would eventually reach everyone in the family. It was already moving forward on its own, slowly and steadily, and when the moment finally arrived for it to be spoken out loud, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would be ready.